I really swear I understand how to do this. It feels like tonight is my first time teaching. Here's the, oh, thank you. I love the backup support in the chat for things like, here's the attendance link. All right, let's try this again. All right, so for our, we'll call it a mini lesson tonight, we're going to do an overview on best practices for twice exceptional students. One of the things that I get told always is, aren't these best practices for all students? Yes, but they are best practices that we know are good for twice exceptional students, and that they are, they tend to have more explicit positive results with our twice exceptional students. And sometimes we also know that when we look at teaching strategies, when it comes to either gifted or special education, on both ends of the spectrum, it's specialized education. And that is what our gifted and special educators really bring to the table, which is different ways to meet the needs of specific populations. So when we're talking about using it like a UDL approach, and that universal design for learning and providing access for everybody, best practices do start to look like for everybody. So overall, when we talk about our twice exceptional approach, we talk about strength-based instruction, and you will hear strength-based instruction a lot from our speakers, and hopefully from me as well. And I like to have my strength-based instruction as, do you guys remember like the little FDA plate that told us, you know, how many carbs and how much protein to have? So when we're talking about strength-based instruction, we actually really want a balanced plate where each section is individualized for the person, but they all have the same basic food groups. Sure. And really the serving is really about having both a healthy mind and a healthy body and a healthy education for our students. So first, I'm going to actually talk about interventions. So when we talk about interventions, we are thinking usually remediation. And when I first started learning and talking about strength-based instruction, we would talk about a student's strengths and weaknesses. But in a presentation I saw earlier this year, the speaker made a point to say that we really need to start talking about strengths and barriers, that weaknesses are relative, that weaknesses can be interpreted. And so it's really about what is the barrier to the student's instruction. Sometimes the barrier is an area that is a specific weakness or an area that does require remediation. And so the way we remove that barrier is to provide an intervention. Sometimes the area is a weakness where accommodations will support the student, or we can build on other strengths as a workaround for what the issue is. But there are times where interventions are necessary. We usually will think about, when we think about those tier 2, tier 3 interventions. We're talking things like Orton-Gillingham, or talking about Math 180, Read 180. But we also might be talking about specific interventions like a behavior intervention plan. We might be looking at, I'm going to call it binder intervention, but you know, when our students with executive functioning needs have their entire paper lives explode, they need a binder intervention to get them back where they need to be. So really, when we talk about these interventions, we're talking about what we are doing to support that student in that specific barrier that's unique to them so that they can access their instruction. The next part of our strength-based instruction approach is acceleration and enrichment. I know that acceleration is not a favorite word in MCPS, but research shows us that the best first approach to students when it comes to differentiation, meeting student need, and providing appropriate instruction really is to accelerate them. Now, do not mishear me that acceleration does not mean grade advancement necessarily. It does not mean course advancement necessarily. Acceleration is exactly that. When we accelerate, my science teachers forgive me, we go faster, right? We're putting our foot on the gas, or however we want to describe that. But I swear, if you put a formula for acceleration in here, I'm gonna, um, we want them to go faster. And sometimes we can accelerate a student in a unit, but not a whole course. Sometimes we can accelerate them in a course, but not move them to the next course. And sometimes it is appropriate to move them to the next course. So when we think about acceleration, the question really becomes what do they already know? Where can we help them go a little bit faster? And when we can do things like limit repetition so that our students who don't need those significant repeats have the opportunity to move to something else, to move into something more deeply, or have more time to be creative thinkers and work on what those areas of strength are. And if we didn't talk about it before, I know it's in one of my early presentations. One of the key differences between students who are gifted versus students who are high achieving or bright versus students who are creative is when we're looking to obtain mastery, a student who is gifted tends to need 1 to 3 repetitions of information in order to retain it. A student who's high achieving tends to need 7 to 10. And students who are primarily creative don't really feel the need for mastery, but they can fall into kind of either of those camps. So if we know a typical student requires 7 to 10 repetitions to retain information, it's not so much that our gifted student needed to learn more things more quickly, it's that they've already retained it after the first 3. And so it's becoming very redundant for them to hear it multiple times. And so our question when we're looking at acceleration and enrichment is, what are we doing to not make them think that they're sitting there and waiting for the class, that they are taking advantage of their opportunities to learn. One phrase I have bolded on here that I feel very, very strongly about is the idea that every child deserves to learn something new every day. And this includes our gifted and our twice exceptional children. I hear this a lot when we're talking about our special education students, and I believe the same thing is true for them, because when I say every child, I mean every child. But just like we acknowledge that some students need a lot more scaffolding or a lot more support to get to the new learning, our students who learn faster and have a greater breadth of knowledge also deserve to learn. And so constantly putting them on the back burner or having them wait, not giving them that opportunity to learn is really wasting their time. It's wasting our time. It's wasting the education system's time. And so really planning for those pieces is crucial to meeting their needs. And I think I will also add, with twice exceptional students especially, that's when they get in trouble. When they have learned it and retained it and you're repeating it for the 5th time, and they don't have the social emotional self-regulation to sit and smile, that's when they're getting in trouble, and that's when they're becoming behavior problems. And I 100% speak from experience on that one. So the next part about strength-based instruction is going to be accommodations. So the difference with an intervention versus an accommodation is the intervention is teaching a missing skill or a slower developing skill, and we're doing like explicit instruction for it. Whereas the accommodation is what we're giving a student in order to, we usually say, level the playing field. In the olden days, we would say, everybody writes with a pencil, but some of our kids got computers. Do you guys remember those days? Now it's almost the flip, where it's like, I know everybody's on the computer, but my little friend over here cannot be on a screen that long. We need to give them paper pencil. It's teaching students what they can do as workarounds or as supports, and then also teaching them how to advocate for those independent skills. So I know another favorite example is, when we were growing up, when some of us were growing up, we were always told, you're not going to have a calculator in your pocket all the time. And of course, now we have a calculator, a dictionary, maps. We have things that at some point would have been considered accommodations. Fidgets are another great example, things that we were trying to get in the classroom and get into the hands of our kids for forever. And then when they became cool, everybody had them, to the point that then we started limiting access to them because they were a distraction for kids who didn't necessarily require them. So, there is a fine line, and that's, I think, where that independent piece and the skill and the self-advocacy piece are so important, because I can advocate for needing a fidget when I teach. I can advocate for having my camera up higher so you cannot see the number of fidgets I have on my desk right now to help keep me focused. But at the same time, we need to teach other strategies. So if you can't have all those things in front of you, that other ways to get around. And if you have a teacher who's saying, those are just toys, you don't need those toys, teaching our students to say, it's actually not a toy, it's a tool to help me focus. It's a tool to help me focus, to help me write, to help me calculate. I understand the big idea, but simple addition is just too much for me. Helping our students speak up for their accommodations is a very important part of our strength-based instruction. And then the last section is, that's why it's the biggest part of the plate, is the case management and the social emotional support. So I said, behind every gifted child, there's a mountain of struggles and insecurities. Our students frequently struggle with that internal monologue of, I'm supposed to be gifted, but I can't do this. How is it possible that I can be, smart and weak at the same time? There's a lot of internal turmoil that goes on with our twice exceptional kids. And because their strengths and their weaknesses or barriers tend to be at such extremes from each other, it's a lot more tumultuous on the inside. Case managers are a crucial part of our students' lives. And from there, the educators who support the case manager. I think I love metaphors. I apologize. I don't apologize. I love metaphors. But, if we're, as a case manager, we're directing the orchestra, and all of the teachers who are teaching our student are playing their instruments, which, is their thing. Our job is to make it all come together in harmony, to make sure that the student is hearing what they're supposed to hear. And it's really hard, right? Because we've got different students and each person has their own thing to play, but we need all the students to do the hearing. And there's a lot of juggling and balancing in there. And so case managers are usually walking or running that line between teaching in the classroom, supporting our students in the classroom, teaching our students the skills so that they can go and talk to their teachers and learn what it is that works best for them. And then also help them manage all those pieces of executive functioning that they really struggle with. I think especially in secondary, our students know what they understand what they're learning. Sometimes they're even doing their work, but their ability to get things from their brain out of their hands onto paper, even digital paper, and then into your proverbial hands as the educator, that by itself is a barrier. We're not even talking about the actual content that they're producing, just the process is a huge barrier for our students. And so that's where our case managers, really come in and do a lot of the coaching, and a lot of the coaching of the teachers, as well as the coaching of the students. One of my most, I think, effective years in the classroom was a year I was actually in the classroom a little bit less, and we got an extra planning period. And really, for my extra planning period, what I would do was I would go to more PLC meetings. I would coach. I would meet with teachers individually. I would pop in and out of classes that didn't have support already, so that if a student specifically needed support, I could go in and help, or I could pull them out. There's so much to putting together and supporting our students so that they can build a positive perception of themselves. Do you have any questions on our little strength-based plate? Thank you for answering the binder question. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move into our next section. This is going to be a fast overview. I 100% know that, but I will dive more deeply into it next week. So we're talking about differentiated instruction. And differentiated instruction is both a buzzword and critical. So we want to make sure that when we're talking about it, that we're talking about how to make it meaningful for the teacher as well as for the student, and not to do it in a way that just checks a box. Oh, this one has a lot of cartoons. So it says, our teacher has an interesting theory. She said teaching is like bowling. all you can do is roll the ball down the middle and hope you touch most of the students. And what does Charlie Brown say? She must be a terrible bowler. So we all know that rolling down the middle is not the best way to approach all students. Sometimes it's the best way not to get scolded, but it's not the best way to reach everybody. And so that's where differentiation comes in. And for our purposes, differentiation is a deliberate adaptation of the curriculum, which includes instructional processes. It includes access to content and depth of content and opportunities for response that meets the need of everybody in the classroom. I won't read my little comic here, but it's kind of like the, how we might use things for different purposes. What differentiation is not, we're not short order cooks. It is not us sitting there and saying, okay, 30 kids, 30 plans, 30 different opportunities. Students who have IEPs obviously do have their own individual plans, and we do have to make instructional planning for that. But even when a student has an IEP, that doesn't mean that they get individual and then nobody else can have it. I think I said to somebody earlier today, if you're working on a project that makes sense for 2 classes, especially if I'm teaching them, use the work, use what you're doing for your classes, because it's more about learning and applying what you know than it is about how many projects can you make. It's about the quality piece. So if you make an accommodation for one kid, make it available to more students. But again, it's not down to 30 different plans for 30 different kids. Or I say my secondary friends, 150 plans for 150 different kids. So this is a helpful screen. Go back and read it later.
Antennas.
Exactly. If you go back and read this later, the what and the why of why we look at differentiation for our twice exceptional students. So sometimes I get asked, does differentiation make our 2E students feel singled out? No, I don't think it makes them feel like that, because it allows our students to be challenged. And a lot of times our students are being singled out anyway because they're not producing, or they're not prepared when they come in, or if they're bored, they're getting themselves into trouble. And so they're already kind of being singled out. But if we're differentiating and differentiating appropriately, then we are meeting the needs of all of the students, and everybody has an opportunity to do something that's meaningful or meets their different. The supports that are needed can be different. And I think it kind of depends. Are we talking a typical special education student, a typical gifted student, a typical, what's the word I'm looking for? A typical average student, normal student? Neither of those words is right.
Neurotypical?
Thank you. More of a neurotypical as opposed to our neurodivergent kids. I think part of it also is when you're doing the differentiation, how you're adding in things like the strengths-based access, and how you're adding in accommodations, and how interventions are supporting that, which is where it starts to look different for our twice exceptional students. Yeah, again, I'm going to let you guys read this on your own. These look pretty familiar if you've been to any class in the last 10 years on differentiated instruction. So there's lots of different ways we can know what our students know. And we really want to make sure that we are thinking about we don't offer all of those ways every single time, but thinking about having a variety of information ways and checkpoints along the way to know what our students are learning. So I do love my cartoons in this one. Yes, I think this one's actually already posted, but I will double check. So our first one is the case for pre-assessment. When we're talking about how do we know if a student needs to be accelerated if a student already knows the information. One of the things that I find most frustrating with a lot of the way we do pre-assessments right now, especially I think some of the elementary curriculum, is when we pre-assess, we're pre-assessing to know if the student has the foundational knowledge to move into the topic. What we're not doing is pre-assessing to know if the student already knows the content. And it's important because, again, if we're teaching students based on what they know and what they need to know, if they already know all the content, then teaching them the content again is not helpful to them or to us. And so one of the reasons that we want to think about different ways to differentiate is because our students might already have a significant amount of knowledge in a subject. And so a pre-assessment, if done correctly, can look at foundational knowledge, but it can also look at already having attained concepts, or if you've attained most concepts in a subject area, where are the gaps that need to be filled in along the way? Oh, look, it's almost like I completely forgot I had the slide that had all this information on it. So the first one I want to talk to you guys about is a THW chart. So what is a THW? A THW is just like a KWL, but it has different letters. This is a new strategy that I've learned recently. And the idea is, instead of asking, what do you know about a subject already? What do you want to know? And then what did you learn? So the problem with that frequently is, I don't know about you, but when I did KWL charts, I don't think I ever went back to L. I took an L on that one, right? So it became a KW. Doesn't give me a whole lot. What a THW chart does is asks, what do you think about this? So it's really saying, you might not know anything, but you have thoughts. Most of our kids come to the table, all of our kids, everyone comes to the table with thoughts, with perceptions, with ideas. And so when we're asking them to approach a new subject, we're asking for what their thoughts and opinions are on that subject already. The second question, what do you want to know? I think it remains valid. And then the last question is, how do you want to learn? So one easy step with differentiation is asking the kids how they want to present the knowledge that they have. Again, we don't necessarily need to do 30 different ways for 30 different kids, but it's going to help give us some insight into what it is the students want to do. So I'm going to show you guys some samples, and understanding that I will give you guys the link to this one as well. Oh, hang on 1 second. Where's my, aha. So we have here our KWL chart where we're asking the students, some pretty direct questions. When we move it to our TWH chart, so in this example, they're asking a student about acting. And so the student is saying, I think acting is fun. I think acting can be stressful. I'd like to learn if acting can be used all the time. I want to know if it's good to overreact. And then in this category, I want to learn about it by acting. I want to learn about what actors and actresses do. And I want to learn about it by going on a field trip to a studio. So in here, the student is giving us an idea of what they already know. And we can also see what they don't know about acting and things that maybe they don't have the language for in acting. So this student here is telling us also about acting, saying it's really fun, it's good for your education. Who came up with acting? Usually, how many people work backstage? How do you make props? So this student, when we're looking about what they want to know about acting, they're thinking about it in more of a production standpoint. They're thinking about not just the people on the stage, but how do we get there? And what do you do to make those productions happen? And then in the how, whoops. And then the how, we're talking about, always participate, pay attention to what my acting teacher says. So it's again telling us that the student has a very different, broader perspective of what acting might look like. But when it comes to like the how they want to learn, they're not giving a whole lot here. And so, but the teacher may know that this is a student who wants to look at production versus performance. I'm going to find one more. I'm going to find it, I promise. I can't find it, so I will look at it later. You can revisit, right? So other type, oh, that slide should have been first. So other types of low prep differentiation. So I really, really like low prep differentiation because it's exactly what it says. It gives me time to focus on the things I might need to focus on, but it still allows the students to have that differentiated opportunity. And I think it also helps dispel the myth that every time you differentiate, it has to be a crash course in theatrics and fancy and whatever. These are some really nice strategies that we can use to differentiate without all of that flash. So one of them is the differentiator. So I think in our readings this week, we had readings about Bloom's taxonomy and the Kaplan-Gould's depth and complexity models. And so what the differentiator does is it allows students to do two different things. One, it allows them to put specific information in and ask how they're going to do it. Or as a teacher, we can pop pieces in there and figure out what is it that we want them to do. And it gives us a direction to go. I've seen it used in both ways. I've seen this used where our teachers will tell the students, you know, you're going to talk about ethics, you're going to use a textbook, and you guys get to pick what the measuring scale is and how you're going to do it with the product. The differentiator lets both the teacher and the student move these things about. Oh, look, I even put a link to it in here. Respondo is another great one because, again, this gives us an opportunity to allow for a more higher or more complex thinking. One of the things I really like about it is where we have some of the opportunities to within English, really is mostly this is meant for literature, different ways for our students to compare knowledge of different topics, of different elements, of different stories. And I think kids can get really, really creative with this. So again, I might tell them, you know, we have 3 texts, you have to pick 2 of them, and then use this to figure out what it is that you're going to do and let them have that opportunity to differentiate for themselves. And again, as far as that low prep goes, it means that we don't have to do as much on the front end as teachers because that part is done for us within the Respondo. I actually think I'm going to stop us here because we do have other folks joining us. And I want to give you guys a quick break. I saw Teresa somewhere in here. So we will pick up on Tuesday where we are leaving off right now with the best practices piece. And go ahead and take your air conditioning, or that's me, air conditioning break. I have a personal air conditioner now and it's blowing less than hot air on me. My room is no longer 90 degrees. We are down to 83. Yes. So I'm going to go take an air conditioning break and refill my water cup. And then we will we'll restart maybe for some discussion right around 7:40. Yes, I will resend the attendance link as well. So I'm going to did say that your voice is a little low in the chat.
Okay. Let me see if I can turn this.
I'm resuming
Try
record.
now. I'll just say a few words. Is that better? Are people still saying too quiet, or are we getting thumbs up, or?
I'm not sure. I just turned up my volume on my thing, but
it's still pretty low.
Still pretty low? Okay. I don't want to blast anybody out of here, but we'll try that. Let's see what the microphone setting is. Well, it should I'll crank it up some more. See how that goes. Not usually a problem that I have with this system, so I'm sorry about that. But I'll just start talking, and if you can't hear, then, you know, raise your hand again and I'll crank it up some more. I'm almost at maximum here, but anyway, I was the gifted youth coordinator for Minnesota Mensa for about 15 years. And during that time, in raising my own two profoundly gifted kids, I came to realize that a lot of the kids that were sort of the cohort that was growing up alongside of my kids were starting to exhibit characteristics of not being heteronormative. And having grown up as a bi gifted kid myself, I felt like, you know, I could sort of spot how some of these things were developing. And so I got into doing some more research, and that led to my getting a master's degree that I designed myself from Metropolitan State University here in St. Paul. And it focused on the challenges that are faced by youth, who are both gifted and members of the LGBTQI community. At that time, that was a little over 10 years ago, there really was very little research out there, very little available in terms of resources for parents or educators. And so I sort of kind of went on a mission and decided that I needed to start doing this. And I got connected with folks at NAGC, the National Association for Gifted Children, the Minnesota Council for the Gifted and Talented, and the Minnesota Educators of the Gifted and Talented, and also the State of Minnesota Department of Education. And I just started writing and presenting, and along the lines, kind of I work to help establish the LGBTQ network that's part of NAGC now. That was a slog getting that set up and going. And I've also helped author a couple of books, one of which is, let's see if you can see this, Needs and Approaches for Educators and Parents of Gifted Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Students. This is available from NAGC and also from Amazon, you know, of course, like everything. And then just a couple of years ago, I was invited to write a chapter on trans and non-binary students for this book published by Proofread Press called Culturally Responsive Teaching and Gifted Education. So those are a couple of resources that I would recommend, you know, if you are interested in getting some more information. The Approaches book is now 5 or 6 years old. At the time we wrote it, we were sort of hoping that, you know, we'd be living in a perfect world by now and that this wouldn't be an issue. But as we all know, that is not the case. In fact, it's been a record year for LGBTQI plus legislation being introduced across the country. Over 600 bills have been introduced this year. I did look up, and for your state of Maryland, you are fortunate in that there was only one bill introduced and it didn't pass. There's a lot of focus on keeping trans women and girls out of athletics. And so that's sort of the hot button these days, along with just general anti-gay sentiment that's being promulgated mostly, you know, by people on the right. So anyway, that's a little bit about me, but I want to go ahead and share my screen and hope that I pick the right one so that we can get, there we go. And then I'll turn off my camera so you don't have to look at me anymore and you can focus on the content. Can everybody see that okay? I'll just take
Yes,
that
it's
as a
beautiful.
yes, since I'm not hearing it. No, we can't see it.
We see it and it's beautiful.
Okay, great. So you got a little information about me. I'm, talking about you, very glad that you're all here. As I mentioned, it's been a challenging year for queer young people. And it's really important, I feel, that educators get formed on some of these challenges, and I'll talk about that at the beginning, and then later on I'll suggest some strategies that you might be interested in using to address the challenges that are being faced by kids who are gifted and LGBTQ plus in your classroom. Um, this is, I know this is being recorded, but I would hope that people will feel comfortable if you've got questions when it's Q&A time, that you would ask those questions, because my goal here is to be as informative and worthwhile for you as possible. So one of the things I want to let you know, and sometimes that might surprise some people, but I do use the word queer quite a bit because I feel that it's a good term that is a little more fluid. These days, especially younger people, don't want to be pigeonholed in particular identities. So having something that is more, all encompassing and not really defining anybody close, in a specific, box, as it were, is more looked on more favorably. And I did want to mention, and it's been a while, but back in 2014, I wrote an article for the 2E newsletter, um, for supplying information and hopefully useful advice for parents who were raising gifted LGBTQ plus students. So that is something that's available on my website, which is linked in the resources that I supply. So we're just going to spend a little time, getting a little overview of and background on these students and some of the elements, the giftedness combined with being LGBTQ, some approaches that adults can take to be good advocates for these students, and then some potential strategies that can be used in schools and classrooms to support largely like visibility, but also supportive uh, policies and so forth for students who identify this way. So just a little bit of background on these kids, and some of you may be, very aware of this, but parents and educators of gifted and talented youth realize, it's not just important when you're a teenager, but it's kind of important at all stages of life that you feel like you fit in somewhere, like you have a sense of belonging. And we know that kids who are identified as gifted, or even before they're identified as gifted, they stand out as being different. And it can be difficult for them to fit in. And they struggle with isolation. They have a hard time finding people who, get their jokes, or who are interested in participating in the kinds of activities that they're interested in. Not everybody gets excited about micrometeorites in grade 2. It's not necessarily something that all kids can relate to, or wants to play chess, those types of things. And when you add gender and or sexual minority status into this, it creates sort of a double whammy for these kids that can make it very difficult, especially if they're hypersensitive, to find peers, whether they're intellectual or emotional, or just kids that they can get along with, who are willing to hang out with them at all. And we don't want to act like everything about these kids has some sort of risk factor associated with it, and we don't want to do everything for them. But we want to, as caring adults in their lives, and whether, educators or relatives or neighbors, we want to be able to provide some ideas for them, some approaches that they can use to navigate the spaces that they have to navigate as students, and find ways to fit in and find ways that they can feel healthy and supported. So the combination of differences I call a situation being twice othered. We've got twice exceptional. There's twice othered as well. And I've heard people refer to being, you know, gifted and learning disabled, and then also queer as being thrice othered. And then you've got some students who are all of those things, and then they're BIPOC students as well. So some of these kids have a lot going on that they could use some help with. Overexcitabilities may compound these struggles. And just in case people haven't heard too much about overexcitabilities before, I do have some information I'm going to provide here in a little bit about that. But basically, these are the things that lead gifted kids to be hypersensitive, and just to really pick up on a lot of, you know, potential irritants and upsetting elements in their environments. One of the things that I see on just about every list of sessions being presented at gifted conferences is something along the lines of, gifted and underachieving, and how to deal with that. Well, a lot of times the kids who are gifted and queer fall into a trap of overachieving, overcompensating to try to make up for the fact that they feel like they're so different. There might be something wrong with them. And depending on how they're being raised at home and the messages that they're getting, they might feel like that they're bad people, and that to compensate for that, they need to be in drama and orchestra and band and student council and the debate team. And throw in athletics and straight A's plus, on top of all of that. So you need to, take some care in observing these students to make sure that they're not falling into that trap. And a big concern for students especially students who are members of the gender and sexual minorities, they can take a hit to their GPAs because of the challenges that they face and the lack of engagement that they might experience, because they're afraid to go to school. You can see here some of the statistics on, and these are for LGBTQ plus students, the frequency of missing days. We've got over 32%, almost a third of these students are missing somewhere between 1 and 6 days of school a month. So I'm also going to talk about potential flexibilities in grading policies. But if the kids are afraid to go to school and they're demonstrating that these statistics, they're missing that much school, they're going to take a hit to their GPAs. And for a lot of gifted kids, they don't encounter true peers until they get to university. So having a situation, an environment in school that's difficult for them can be really problematic in terms of their future trajectory. And I don't mean to sound overly dramatic, but it's true. It's documented that the GPA can take from half to a point of hit depending on how much school they miss. And that we all know that the admissions process is very, very competitive, and that can make the difference between a very bright, gifted student who's got a lot to offer, if they can get into the right school and get the proper education, they may not be able to do that if their grades don't support it. And over half of LGBTQ plus students who have considered dropping out of school do this, consider it because they're harassed at school. So there's some kind of grim statistics here, but I think it's important that everybody is aware of these because I think a lot of times people think, especially with gifted students, well, they'll figure their way out. You know, they're smart. They got this, but they don't, in fact. And it's important to know that, you know, more than 2/3 of LGBTQ students feel unsafe at school. And this is particularly true if they're genderqueer, non-binary, trans. Many of them avoid gender segregated spaces in school because they feel unsafe. You know, locker rooms are one thing. Not everybody's taking gym all the time, but it's a safe assumption that everybody needs to go to the bathroom at some point during the day. And can you imagine going to school in the morning and thinking, there isn't a safe place for me to go to the bathroom all day? That has psychological implications. It has physical health implications because students are either not drinking enough water all day, so they might get dehydrated, or they're holding it, and that can cause illness as well. So there's just a lot of problems with gender segregated spaces in school. Most of these kids avoid school functions because they feel unsafe or uncomfortable. And you know, we always hear, and I heard this a lot when I homeschooled my kids for a few years, but oh, the socializing, isn't that so important? Well, they're going to miss out on it if they're not allowed to go with their same sex friend that they want to go on a date with, or if it's, you know, a father-daughter dance and nobody in their house identifies as either of those things. So they skip the dances, they might skip, you know, the games just because there's just so much, especially in high school, hypersexualization based on, you know, gender conformance, stereotypes. Almost all LGBTQ students hear the word gay used in a negative way at school. And it's obviously not enough is being done on the, whether it's policy level or enforcement level or whatever the issue is, but it's not enough is being done to stop this. And most of these students report personally experience LGBTQ related discriminatory policies or practices. They get disciplined more. They are excluded from extracurricular activities. I mentioned the trans athletics issues earlier on. It's a huge problem for these students. Now, this information all came from the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. They run a survey every odd year, and then they publish the results in the following year. So these numbers are from 2021, which it's interesting, you know, we were still seeing a lot of schools that hadn't reopened fully from COVID, and but the LGBTQ students were still experiencing these things. Even, you know, you'd have to assume a lot of this was happening online as well as in person. And one thing I want to point out too is that about 80%, 81% of queer students report experiencing some form of like bullying or harassment. Um, it that gets to a physically violent stage, and about half of that is happening at home. So if you are seeing these kids in the classroom and they are having difficulties functioning in your classroom, there's a good chance that there is stuff happening at home that's making it very difficult for them to bring their, their A game to the classroom on a day-to-day basis.
We had a question.
Sure.
If you could possibly describe the survey sampling process.
Oh boy. I'm not entirely sure how Glisten runs these surveys, but I have a link to the executive summary that has the statistics that talks about their methods in the resources slides at the end of my presentation. So I'm sorry I can't call it right off the top of my head exactly how they do this. So as I mentioned earlier, about 600 plus anti-LGBTQ plus bills were introduced nationwide this year. That one in Maryland, as I mentioned, targeted trans girls' participation in athletics, but it didn't get out of committee, fortunately. So there are some policy and structure areas that have an impact on students' experiences. For students who don't fit into the sort of heteronormative dominant culture, school dress codes can be problematic unless there's sort of a basic, hey, everybody wears khaki bottoms and a navy blue top and whatever you want, mix or match, as long as it's clean and not full of holes. If schools, and some schools still do, get into specific gender aligned dress codes, that can be hard for these kids. Like I've read it, like there are schools that have insisted that, the boys wear blue cap and gown for graduation and the girls wear white, and it's like, why? There's no real practical justification for that. So it why is that a priority? And if dress codes can be made so that they're gender neutral, that's the best approach. Bathrooms, as I mentioned earlier, can be very difficult. You know, I don't know anybody who's got gender segregated bathrooms at home. So I think that people are reading way too much into the importance of segregating bathrooms by gender. But I know that construction can be expensive, but I think that it behooves schools to figure out ways to give access to trans and non-binary students, as far as, finding a bathroom that aligns with their gender identification and is a safe space for them. Events, as I mentioned, instead of having the father-daughter dance, have, kid bring favorite grown-up to this event that's going on, instead of making it so gender stratified. Club space and safe space is really important to queer students. Since COVID, we've seen a drop of about a third in the number of gay straight alliances that are in place across the country. And so I'm sure, it was difficult for people to get together and to keep these things going. So there's going to be some rebuilding that's going to happen. But ultimately, there needs to be equal space and support given to whatever the different clubs are. If the chess club has a room, then the GSA should have a room. And if the chess club gets money for snacks, then the GSA should get money for snacks. These safe spaces are really important for these kids. Anti-bullying policies are also very important. I saw that there are a lot of resources available in your district, and that looked great. I wasn't able to find a specific anti-bullying policy, but I may have missed it. But if there isn't one, that's a great thing to, get together and lobby your legislature to enact for your state. The state of Minnesota has a Safe and Secure Schools Act, which is kind of a great thing. Obviously needs enforcement, but what it does is it sends a message to all schools and districts that there have to be policies in place. They need to be enforced, and they need to make it so that all students feel safe at school. Curriculum and grading policies. As I mentioned earlier, this is an equity issue. So if you have kids who don't feel safe entering the building or don't feel safe navigating the hallways to get from one class to the next, then basing grades on attendance and having their seat in a seat, or feeling comfortable enough in a classroom to raise their hand and answer a question. If you've got these kids, then and it's a matter of equity to adjust the grading policies to accommodate their specific needs. I think it's safe to say that they're not making up these fears. You saw the statistics. But if educators can figure out a way to ensure that the student is achieving mastery, which for gifted students is usually not the issue, then there should be some flexibility in the grading policies. And then also curriculum that provides visibility in the classroom for these students. Um, it's very important, and we know this, research shows that the students, whatever minority they might belong to, if they can see themselves in the curriculum, if they can see themselves in teachers and in the events that are going on, their chances of engaging with school and with the curriculum are increased. And then parental support and advocacy. This can be a real challenge sometimes. There are some parents who are awesome and are behind their kids every step of the way, and they're in there advocating for them and working with, like-minded educators to make sure that the classroom is a supportive environment. But we all know that they're not all like that. So I'm going to present some information or some ideas later on about ways that you might interact with parents in order to get them to become advocates and assisters rather than resistors. So the Biden administration has made a huge change in the whole sort of environment around um, education as it relates to queer students. And it's really great to see that our Secretary of Education is working hard to ensure that Title IX is also supporting students who are members of gender or sexual minorities. There's supposed to be some new rule changes. They were to have been released in the spring, but there was a very, very heavy volume of comments received on these rules. And so they're taking a little longer to get through them. But the plan now is to release them in October. So I know a lot of times people say, well, it seems like every other week we're hearing about a new term, and I'm not sure how to navigate all these. I'm not sure if I understand, who's what or what I'm supposed to say or if it's real. But the bottom line here is that you don't really have to understand, and you don't necessarily have to always be worried about using the exact correct term. These individuals know who they are better than any of the rest of us ever will. And if you're not sure, just ask. Say, hey, I want to be sure that I am being as respectful of you as possible. And so, tell me how you want to be referred to, because it's really important to me to demonstrate that I have respect for you. And I know I may mess up sometimes, but I'm, I'm trying to do, say the right things and do the right things. So that's just a little note there. So I will quickly go over these overexcitabilities, kind of striking a balance here between doing an introduction of them and going over stuff that other people are already familiar
We
with.
we did cover
You
overexcitabilities,
did.
and I
Okay.
did the reading from an earlier module, but
Okay.
always happy
So
to have.
this is not new information to you then?
I hope
You
not.
you're familiar with, kids who hate labels in their shirts and seams in their socks and loud noises and that all that good stuff. So yeah, even to the point of like can't leave newspapers around because the headlines might be too evocative. I don't know if you've read any of Michael Piakowski's work. He worked with Kazimierz Dabrowski, and he wrote a book called Mellow Out, They Say, If Only I Could. And he also wrote a chapter in a book called, Expert Advice on Working with Gifted Learners. And what he said is that overexcitabilities ring loud and clear in the gifted population. And I think if you've worked with them, this, and that students may exhibit some or all of these. And they're they're a real uh, a strong characteristic that needs to be addressed when you're working with these kids. And beyond those overexcitabilities, or kind of maybe supported by those, gifted students are or have a reputation for having a heightened expectation for justice. They don't want to witness uh, seeing others around them treated with, being on the receiving end of unconscious bias. They also don't want to experience themselves. And they tend to be more androgynous. Stephanie Tolan, I don't know if you've talked about her at all. She's done a lot of writing on gifted kids, and her research has revealed that, and I would tell you from most Mensa meetings that I've gone to, I could tell you this is true, that androgynous tendencies tend to run in the gifted population. And this is true for the teens and adults that sort of set us outside of gender expression norms, excuse me. Um, and back to also the challenge of isolation, the sense of not fitting in. And under all of this is sort of there's a desire to be true to the self that can sometimes conflict with the need to stay safe. And that need to be the authentic self can be a very challenging thing for these students and can set off a lot of internal conflicts for them. So I have a Russian doll metaphor that I came up with that talks about, identity factors. And if you think of the layers of the doll, the little dolls within the dolls, as aspects of our identities, we've got, our family background, our sex assigned at birth, social class, religion, sexuality, level of intelligence. All of these things are elements of that that could be little dolls that make up the whole picture of who we are. And it's up to each individual to decide how the dolls are assembled and which are revealed or not, and where and in what contexts. So you might see a student who is out to you, or perhaps out to a couple of members of a class, but not to other people. So they might ask you to use they, them pronouns when you talk to them, but then you might see them in another classroom where they'll go back to whatever the pronouns are that are associated with their sex at birth. I would ask you to trust them, to know their own identity, and to respect what they have told you about themselves. Because if they feel safe with you, that's great. But they may not feel that level of safety somewhere else. So it's not being disingenuous. They're just trying to keep themselves safe. So they might hide that doll inside all the other ones. So in certain circumstances, because they don't feel like they're safe to reveal that aspect of their personality or identity. So this is just a metaphor that I find useful to when discussing elements of identity and why some students might seem to act one way in one place and a different way somewhere else. I have a note for you on pronouns. This is from the Trevor Project, and I did put a link to the Trevor Project in my resource slides. Transgender and non-binary youth who have their pronouns respected by most people in their lives are 50% less likely to attempt suicide. That is a huge number, and it doesn't cost anything, to use the right pronouns. If we can do that consistently, and admitted that sometimes we might make a mistake, correct ourselves and move on. But when you somewhere between 35 and 40% of youth who are members of gender sexual minorities contemplate suicide, the higher numbers occur in the trans and non-binary youth. If we can just use the right pronouns, you can literally save lives. And I know some states, specifically our neighbor here, I'm in Minnesota, our neighbors in North Dakota, they have told educators that they're not allowed to respect students' pronouns. And there was a superintendent who, his video of him has gone viral, getting up in front of a school board and saying, now I'm gonna respect these kids' pronouns because I want them to live to see graduation. And that's kind of what it boils down to. So we see differences for students who are gifted and straight versus kids who are gifted and queer. There are several ways that they are very much alike. They want to be their authentic selves. They may experience overexcitabilities and hypersensitivities. They have a strong sense of justice, strong need for academic and artistic challenges, heightened self-awareness from an early age, and they may be a target for bullying. Gifted kids who were straight and, and cisgender have also been suicidal and attempted suicide as a result of being bullied for being gifted. Ways that these kids are unlike each other. The queer kids may have limited or no support at home. They may be rejected by instead of a source of pride for their family members and or classroom teachers. they are often targets for violence. As I mentioned, more than 80% of them on the GLSEN surveys in the past have said that they had experienced violence, and about half of that had happened at home. And they're less likely to be nominated for gifted programs because they may not present as the model student. But there are ways that we can support these kids. It's critical that they sense, just like all kids, that they sense that there are adults in their lives who have their backs. If we can support these kids throughout their educational journeys and make sure that they are getting access to the programming that they need, then they're more likely to be successful. They're more likely to engage with school and get better grades and show up, even if they're not always comfortable being there. This reduces suicidal ideation, especially for trans and non-binary kids. And it creates a school climate that supports diversity generally. And this is something that I think doesn't get mentioned often enough, is that when school systems and school environments are supportive of one or two forms of diversity, sort of initially, that kind of thing spreads, and it makes more people who may not fit into, the specific categories of the population at large in the school. It will make them feel more comfortable and more respected in that environment. So next I'm going to go on to some potential strategies, but before I do that, are there any other questions that people wanted to ask?
I have a question about the giftedness and fairness.
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard, you're kind of breaking
So,
up a little bit.
Okay, I'll put it in the chat.
Okay.
We just mostly had some comments in the chat. Pointing out that not all kids have a dad or sometimes a mom to bring to events. Some people noting that parents complaining about the GSA clubs in the schools.
Right. So I guess I'm wondering how the school administration reacts when there are complaints about GSAs.
So the person who put this in the chat said that unfortunately the principal at the time backed up the parents who complained. Sorry, so the question that is in the chat is, so we know that queer kids are more likely to be identified as gifted. Is this because gifted kids have better introspection and interpersonal intelligence and are thusly able to more accurately identify themselves at a younger age? Or is there a similar phenomenon among queer adults?
Well, I actually I'm not sure if it's that if the queer kids are more likely to be identified as gifted, or if the gifted kids are more likely to be identified as queer. And it's not just the students. It is, this manifests itself through the lifespan. Not everybody gets identified for gifted programs when they're young, but the tendency to have a greater self-awareness and better, stronger sense of self, can lead to, yes, people, young people being who are gifted, saying, no, actually, you know what, I am this person. I am not what everybody has told me I am all along here, as far as whether it's being straight or being cisgender. And so that, yeah, they would be more likely to um, feel like they needed to break out of a mold that they were put in by others, um, than the kids who are not gifted. I know, like, there's a psychologist here in the Twin Cities who I encounter a lot at gifted seminars and conferences, and we were comparing notes, and um, she's determined to do a research project on how many people there are in the gifted community that identify as queer, because she is seeing in her practice a good half of the patients that she sees, starting usually in early adolescence, coming out at some point or another. And that's the same thing that I witnessed when I was running my gifted youth program for Mensa, is that as they approach their teen years, they've started coming out in droves. And I would say, or I saw, probably about somewhere between 40 and 60% being non-heteronormative, and close to half being trans or non-binary. So I'm not, like I said, I'm not sure, and I don't think that the research has been done yet that really examines if there's, like, any causal connection. But there certainly is an anecdotal one.
I think that's really helpful. We actually had a student speaker on Tuesday night, and she spoke about that, like, I think the comment she made was that, like, all of her friends came out at the same time. And I know from my perspective, I was like, that kind of is showing, yeah, what you're saying. They're finding themselves, they're identifying themselves. And they all just happen to be in my twice exceptional program at that school. So another question, this might be in your next section, but based on your experience, what are the 3 most important things we as teachers can do to support our kids in the classroom and at school?
Well, I think that is actually a good lead in. I'm not sure that I've got things narrowed down quite to that, 3 most important things, but perhaps if I go through the next section of my presentation, and you can assess for yourself what you think is the most important, and also in the context of what you think you could actually enact, that
We can make it an exit ticket for you to summarize your 3 takeaways.
okay, I better make a note to myself.
Oh no, I'm going to make them do that.
Okay, good. All right. So since parents have complained about GSAs, and since parents are inserting themselves into the realm of education more and more these days, I think that attempting to connect with parents as key stakeholders is kind of a critical thing, because they can get you going along the the journey or and help you with it, or they can totally derail all your efforts. You know, ideally, these are key players in their students' lives, although not all parents are. Um, Either as supporters or roadblocks. You know, they might be super behind their kids all the way, you know, take them to pride parades, buy them rainbow clothes, even if, you know, they aren't allowed to wear them to school. Um, or they can, you know, kick them out of the house. There are still more than 25% of kids getting kicked out when they come out to their parents. So that we've got, you know, LGBTQ plus youth accounting for somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of homeless youth, even though they do not account for 40% of the population of their age cohort. So if there are ways that you can even get a couple of parents on your side for to support your any classroom initiatives that you might have, maybe get them to go to a parent teacher organization meeting and talk about how they support the GSA. Get them to show up at the school board meetings to support inclusive curriculum. um, get them to buttonhole leaders in, you know, district and state education department leaders on supporting these kids. Sometimes it only just takes one or two supportive parents to take the wind out of the sails of the haters. And you know, obviously you need to get to know them a little bit and figure out if they would be your assisters instead of being resistors, for initiatives or class or school-wide programs that you might want to get going. But then, you know, ask them, ask for help. So often parents are saying, well, what can I do, you know, to help in the classroom? Ask them this and try to get them to be part of the solution. And then also the district really and the school needs to be very clear in its communications to parents about issues like bullying and diversity and integration and support for students at school who are members of minority groups. It takes that kind of messaging from the top to sometimes convince parents to be willing to step up and actually make positive change. Um, if you could maybe assemble from the parents of the kids in your classroom a list of speakers or presenters or mentors. Sometimes that's a good way to approach supporting these students. And you know, obviously they can't be alone with students, um, but to have them come into the classroom and talk about, you know, what they do, and especially if you have students, because, you know, as I mentioned, not all families have, you know, a father-daughter construct in the house. Not all kids have two or opposite sex parents. So it's important for us to see other, you know, adults coming in and doing worthwhile things in the classroom. And especially like if there's a student who has two moms or two dads, having one of their parents come in and talk to the classroom. Obviously, there would have to be some rules of the road, but you kind of get the idea that just sort of opening up broader involvement of parents who are maybe not you know, straight, white, cisgender people, to be involved with your classroom and to support the initiatives that you have in your classroom with, the ultimate result being hopefully support of curricular and activity visibility for LGBTQ students. Universal screening. And I'm not sure if this is an initiative that Maryland is talking about, but Minnesota is talking about it a lot.
It is
Yeah.
a policy in Maryland, and it's part of our county policy as well for universal screening at
Okay.
grades 2, 3, 5, and 7.
Oh, okay. And then, okay. So, but the kids in K and 1, is there a policy for any way to, like, early entrance kindergarten
There is early entrance to kindergarten, definitely in our county. I think also it's a state thing. The state law is that we have to have at least one universal screening by 2nd grade. So some
Okay.
counties do K1, our county does grade 2.
That's fantastic, because this is, as I'm sure you're seeing, I'm not sure, I don't know how long this has been in effect, but this really levels the playing field for a lot of these kids, because, if you're not getting support at home, your parents are not likely to nominate you to be tested. If you maybe rub a teacher the wrong way, you're not going to get nominated that way either. But if you're gifted and you're bored and you're acting out, you're not going to get nominated that way either. But if everybody's getting tested, that's awesome, because then you'll get a wide swath, assuming that the instruments that are being used are culture fair. Then you're going to have a much better chance of including all the kids who qualify to be identified in those programs. So that's awesome.
Our testing tools and processes, I'm going to say up for debate right now, but all students are screened regardless of all the things you mentioned. And I think it's generally pretty common that if you have a kid you think is gifted who's acting out in class, you've probably called me to your school to help out. So
Ah.
it's not the most effective system, but it exists.
All right. Well, and you're all here, so I assume that there is at least some requirement for professional learning. That doesn't always involve education on or professional development on issues related to LGBTQ plus, but you can spread the word. The great thing about having mandated professional learning is that then people can't opt out of, well, I'm not comfortable with that subject, I don't want to hear about that subject. But if it's required, then short of putting earplugs in or whatever, everybody needs to hear about it or will hear about it at some point. And that's really important for making sure that educators, administrators, everybody at every level is aware and is working on developing cultural competency. And again, this isn't just for LGBTQ plus students, this is for all students that belong to minority groups.
I haven't done the training yet this summer, but generally every summer we do a one on religious expression. We do one on LGBTQ. We have policy in our county about referring to students by their preferred names and pronouns. We have policy or procedures around finding out from kids if the parents know how they're presenting, so that we can be careful in how we talk to them. I haven't done this year's training. I know they've done some changes to it, but I don't think they've taken any of that away. I think they've just condensed it into fewer modules.
Well, that all sounds great. And it's seems like, at least the structures are in place to support improvements in this area so that, maybe not every policy or whatever is being followed to the letter every day, but the policies are there and people are learning about them and they're learning how to apply them, and the leadership is making it known that that's important to them, and that's really important. So, I'm sure you're aware, if you've, experienced this training, that you know that it helps ensure children receive equitable access to programs and services, and increases the likelihood that there will be culturally responsive teaching. And that will be gradually over time enhanced for underserved groups. So I would encourage you to check out that culturally responsive teaching and gifted education book that I showed you, because it's not, there is LGBTQ plus and there's trans and non-binary, but there's a whole lot of different information on students from different racial and ethnic groups, ELLs, and just, a wide variety of different, cultural backgrounds, where learning how to identify one's own implicit biases or unconscious biases and how to then mitigate them is really important for a whole swath of underserved groups of students. And then documented policies to support inclusion are super important, and it's really critical that they get put in place, because we all have worked with that really passionate person who gets all these great things going and everybody loves what they're doing, or most everybody does. There's always going to be a couple of naysayers, but they're doing wonderful things. They're setting up great stuff. People are showing up for their events. They're finding great books for teachers to use in their classrooms and to include in the curriculum. And then they get a better offer and then they're gone. But if along the way, with all that great stuff happening, you can get all these policies, these programs, these different approaches to making sure that different cultures are being respected and LGBTQ students are being respected, if you can get all of that codified and weave it into the workings of the school and the district, then when that super amazing, passionate person does move on, then all is not lost, because you've got a history, you've got it written down, people know that this is how things work, and you're not going to have to start from scratch all over again. Getting your community stakeholders involved and getting everybody on board all over again. It'll be set. And not to say that there are never hiccups with even taking this approach, but it's so much better than just relying on that one really awesome person, or however many. Just they do move on, and you don't want to lose all the programming and all the work that was done along the way by them, because then you're starting over again. And then also, you want to have some consistency. You want to be doing things that are predictable, that people are used to. So because every time you make changes, people tend to get a little upset. And so if it could just, if you could have things set out so that they can keep working the way they've been working, then you're less likely to ruffle feathers when you're, introducing this year's new books that relate to students who come from different types of family backgrounds or cultural backgrounds of whatever kind.
I don't know how many people on here know this, but this summer, every week that there's been a board meeting, they have sent home, or they have sent out a message to us who work at central office to consider alternate workplaces so that we don't have to have run-ins with people who are out protesting specifically about the inclusion of novels in our curriculum.
You're
Wow.
kidding.
That's just talk, talk about enabling. I'm sorry, that's just.
Oh, they're still including the books. They just say to us, like, you guys are welcome to work from home today so that you don't have to run into protesters and have those like public confrontations.
Yeah.
They let them in the board meeting.
Have there been a lot of protesters?
I don't know because I like working from home, so I just take advantage. But
That's just,
I think
that's
we've had
just
3
crazy.
messages this summer.
Really?
And as one of the people who has they were protesting today. Somebody said they had students from their school protesting today. So he's one of the people who has selected the novels that are going in, and it's funny because we added a bunch last year too, and nobody really noticed because they didn't make a big deal of it. But it's a thing right now. And I'm sure they will all be thrilled to know we're adding even more this year. So
Well, good for you. Yeah, just, keep adding more and then there will be so many that they just can't, they'll just have to give up, right?
right.
It's a
I mean,
lost cause.
and the thing is for our curriculum, it's all choice novels. We're just making sure that everybody has choices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but there are some people who don't want other people's kids to have choices,
Right.
unfortunately. So it sounds like you folks have a pretty good handle on, curriculum and activities to create visibility. I'm hoping that maybe I can make a couple of other suggestions, things that you can do to create visibility for LGBTQ plus students. There are a lot of things on the calendar every year, and I don't know if your schools support them at all, but so everybody's pretty much familiar with June being Pride Month, but June 1st is LGBTQ Families Day, and usually school is still in session then. In October is the National Coming Out Day, and October is also LGBTQ History Month. Trans Day of Remembrance is in November. There's an April Day of Silence that highlights the erasure and invisibility of LGBTQ plus people. So there are all these things that could be worked into the curriculum. And there are movies and books that you could share with your students, historical resources to include. You can highlight, if you're doing in literature, doing a unit on women writers, you can highlight Willa Cather, who was a lesbian author. Could show the movie about Alan Turing, The Imitation Game. That could go over really well in history. And so, yeah, the author, in the case of Willa Cather, was a lesbian. Alan Turing was a gay man. But their work is their work, and it stands up to, comparison to the works of people who are not members of the LGBTQ community. And it's important for students to see that, oh, hey, not only are there other people like me, but they've done some great things. They've written good books. They cracked the code that helped us win World War II, things like that, to highlight LGBTQ people queer people in US Congress. And I'm sure there are some in your local legislature, city councils, so forth, that might, come in to talk on a topic that ties in with something that you're doing in social studies or reading or whatever, but find ways to work these people and their works into the curriculum so that the students can see themselves in it, and it helps them aspire to produce great things, and to know that they can accomplish things in their lives, even if maybe in 8th grade things are pretty tough right now. And if you can plan special events that feature diverse people with diverse viewpoints, as I mentioned, and make them school-wide, not just, this is, well, the GSA is going to have this specific guest speaker. The other kids need to be exposed to this too. And so then overall, the students will have consistent opportunities to see their identities acknowledged and supported in school, and know that they count and that their presence there is valued. One of the things that we hear as a complaint sometimes is that young students shouldn't learn about LGBTQ identities. Well, the identities are not about teaching sex ed. These kids need to know how to talk about and talk to the people that they see in their everyday lives. And they need to learn how to love and respect those people. So I'll just quickly talk about evaluating progress, because we all know data is king. And if you can take surveys of your students and see how they like the programs, and show that you're responding to their feedback, that will help your program continue, and it will help your students see that not only are they seeing themselves in your curriculum, but they're seeing the fact that their feedback and their concerns are listened to and addressed, and that the results are reflected in the programs moving forward. And I know we've just got a couple of minutes left, but I can hang around if you can hang around, and I'm going to stop sharing now so that I can actually see what's coming in the chat here. I'm sorry, I couldn't do that because I was using multiple screens and it just was not going to show up.
So I had something sent to me privately so that I can just read it.
Okay.
Oh, let me scroll back and find it. So we had one person who commented that in their school, there was a student who created a homophobia club, and the principal refused to discipline them because the principal didn't want to violate that student's family beliefs. And I don't know if we're looking for like advice on how do you advocate against that, or commiseration with general poor decisions, but
Well, so is disrespectful behavior, is that not a violation of school policy?
so it should be, but
It
I
should
think it's
be.
one of those things that is also up to the interpretation of
Well, I guess my approach
I
would
don't
be, well,
think it,
here are the school rules, and homophobia is by definition, it's disrespectful, hateful behavior. We don't allow that here. You may allow that at home, but we have to support, a broad range of students, and we can't support that here because that is damaging to others.
yeah, I mean, honestly, it is a violation of our policies, and it's pretty clear in the everything that we do. So yeah, I mean, I honestly don't know what you do when it's the principal leading that charge of inappropriateness,
I would go up to the superintendent.
contact your
Yeah.
director,
What's that?
contact the director.
Oh, okay.
We are a school district of 160,000, so there are lots of layers between
Oh, okay.
schools and, but yeah, I mean, and I think that also is a good time to remember that, you know, we do have an equity office, and part of the equity office does deal with LGBTQ plus issues, students, training, and sometimes if you just need an advocate and you feel like somebody else out there needs to know this, then they're a good place to go.
Maybe we could do some educating, because maybe the principal doesn't understand like the level of impact it has on students, and you know, with depression and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Suicide.
I would say, unfortunately, I know who the person is, and that is not the reason. But I appreciate, yeah, I mean, you want it to be a lack of understanding and a lack of knowledge, and you feel like you should be able to say, this is bad because these kids will, you know, it's bad for these kids. And it's a lot harder when the person knows that and then actively chooses to support support the homophobia.
It sort of should be, antithetical to being an educator, but
I,
we all know that's not always the case, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, that's when it reminds us that we still do have work to do. And I appreciate the folks who come to this and stay, and
Yeah.
the few folks here that we had who begged me to record tonight because they couldn't make the class. And so, you know, it's nice to know we do have advocates. And I think one of the things I like to help with is giving words and giving a voice so that our people do know how to advocate. Because I know I've also felt, not necessarily on this topic, but sometimes I want to advocate and I want to stop and be that disruptor, and I don't know what I'm supposed to say to do it. And I think sometimes the help in having speakers like you here and giving us this information is that it gives us statistics. Wow.
Yeah, and I want to be sure that I can share this deck with you too, because as I mentioned, it's got a lot of links in there, and
Mhm.
oh shoot, I know we're over time.
If you shoot it to me in an email, I will put it in our classroom
Okay,
course.
that's great. Yeah, because there's like the NAGC diversity toolkit, there's suggestions on films and books and things to do for different times of the year. There's a lot of stuff.
I don't know if the person's still here. I think they are. Does the homophobia club at that school still exist? I think not, because I think the problem made the Washington Post.
Mm,
And you know, I mean, that's one of the things I've always been taught is never do anything that's going to make the 6 o'clock news. And
right,
apparently
right.
I missed that memo.
Well, and that's one way to address a problem with
Absolutely.
someone in so-called leadership who's supporting homophobia, is say, okay, fine, I'm going to the press. Yeah.
So I'm actually going to stop the recording
Okay.
and